Madonna Mia, I'll never forget the afternoon of March 18, 1945, when I heard my grandmother's voice speaking Italian in the prisoner compound at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, only to discover it was coming from a captured enemy soldier who'd grown up just 3 miles from where Nonna Marcelli was born in Abruzzo. The Mississippi sun was warming the wooden barracks, dogwood trees were blooming white and pink along the fence line, and Bing Crosby's That's Amore was playing on someone's radio in the guard shack, creating the strangest moment of recognition I'd ever experienced in my life. I was Sergeant First Class Anthony Tony Marcelli, 1st Armored Division Military Police, and after 2 years of fighting from North Africa to southern Germany, I thought I understood the clear distinction between us and them, between American soldiers fighting for democracy and Axis soldiers fighting for fascism. My family had come to America from Italy in 1923, escaping poverty and seeking opportunity, and I'd grown up believing that made me more American than Italian, more loyal to the Stars and Stripes than to the old country. But what happened during those 5 months at Camp Shelby would challenge everything I thought I knew about loyalty, identity, and the bonds that connect people across oceans and nationalities. Those Italian and German prisoners would teach me that sometimes the lines between friend and enemy aren't drawn by governments and uniforms, but by shared memories, common experiences, and the recognition that we're all part of the same human family. My assignment to Camp Shelby began on March 15, 1945, after I was wounded during the crossing of the Rhine near Mainz and spent 4 weeks recovering in a field hospital. Shrapnel from a German Panzerfaust had caught me in the shoulder and chest, not serious enough to send me home, but severe enough to keep me out of frontline combat while the 1st Armored pushed into central Germany. The camp was one of the largest POW facilities in the United States, housing over 3,000 prisoners in a sprawling complex of wooden barracks, workshops, recreational facilities, and administrative buildings spread across several hundred acres of Mississippi pine forest. Most of the prisoners were German, captured during various campaigns from North Africa to the Rhineland, but there was also a significant population of Italian prisoners who'd been taken during the Sicily and Italian campaigns. When Colonel Robert Mackenzie briefed me on my assignment, he made special note of my Italian background and language skills. "Sergeant Marcelli," he said, reviewing my personnel file in his office overlooking the main compound, "I see your family came from Italy and you speak the language fluently. That's going to be valuable here. We've got about 400 Italian prisoners who've been difficult to manage because of communication barriers and cultural misunderstandings." He paused, studying my face with the expression of an officer trying to gauge how I might react to guarding soldiers from my family's homeland. "I need to know if you're going to have any problems maintaining discipline with Italian prisoners. I understand the emotional complexity of the situation, but these men are still enemy soldiers, regardless of where your grandmother was born." I assured him that my loyalty was to America and the uniform I wore, that I could maintain professional standards regardless of any personal connections I might feel. But privately, I was curious about these Italian prisoners, wondering what they were like, whether they reminded me of my relatives back in Abruzzo, whether they'd chosen to fight for Mussolini, or had simply been caught up in circumstances beyond their control. My first day in the Italian section of the compound, March 16, 1945, was like stepping into my childhood memories of family gatherings in South Philadelphia. The prisoners were gesticulating wildly while they talked, their voices rising and falling with the musical cadence of Italian conversation that I remembered from visits to my great-aunt Teresa's house. But these weren't the cheerful family discussions I remembered. These were men debating the war, their captivity, their uncertain futures, and their complex feelings about America, Italy, and the choices that had brought them to this Mississippi prison camp. The senior Italian prisoner was Maggiore Carlo Benedetti, a career officer who'd commanded a regiment during the defense of Sicily. He was a small, dignified man with graying hair and intelligent eyes, who carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, despite wearing the simple work clothes issued to all prisoners. When I approached the group for my first inspection, Benedetti stood and addressed me in careful English. "Sergeant, I am Maggiore Benedetti, senior Italian officer in this section. I wish to discuss arrangements for my men and to ensure proper cooperation with American authorities." His formal tone and military courtesy were impeccable, but I could see him studying my face and name tag with curiosity. After a moment, he switched to Italian. "Scusi, Sergeant, but your name, Marcelli, This is Italian, no? From where in Italy does your family come? The question caught me off guard. I'd expected to guard Italian prisoners, but I hadn't anticipated being questioned about my own family background. After a moment's hesitation, I replied in Italian. My grandmother came from Abruzzo near Pescara, but I'm American, Maggiore. My loyalty is to the United States. Benedetti nodded respectfully. Of course, Sergeant. I would expect nothing less. But it is interesting to meet an American soldier with Abruzzese blood. I myself am from Roma, but I have many friends in Abruzzo. The exchange was polite but formal, and I thought it would remain that way. But 3 days later, everything changed when a new group of Italian prisoners arrived from a camp in North Carolina, including a man whose recognition of my name would create a connection that transcended military duty and national loyalty. The moment that changed everything happened on March 18th during afternoon roll call in the Italian compound. As I was checking names against my roster, one of the new prisoners, a sergeant named Giuseppe Romano, stopped dead when he heard my name. Marcelli? He said in rapid Italian. Sergeant, did you say your name is Marcelli? Yes, I replied cautiously, not sure where this was leading. Giuseppe's face lit up with recognition and excitement. Madonna Santissima, are you perhaps related to the Marcelli family from Castel di Sangro? The family that had the bakery near the church of San Pietro? The question hit me like a physical blow. Castel di Sangro was my grandmother's village, and my great-grandfather had indeed owned a bakery near the church of San Pietro before the family emigrated to America in 1923. My grandmother, Rosa Marcelli, came from Castel di Sangro, I said slowly. She left in 1923 with her husband and children. Giuseppe practically shouted with joy. Rosa Marcelli, I knew Rosa Marcelli. She was my mother's cousin. Her father Antonio was my grandfather's brother. We are family, Sergeant. We are cousins. The revelation that I was guarding my own cousin, however distant, created an immediate crowd of Italian prisoners who gathered around to hear this incredible coincidence. Other prisoners began chiming in with their own connections to Abruzzo, to families they'd known, to villages where their relatives had lived. Sergeant Marcelli, said Caporal Maggiore Franco Di Marco, a tank commander from the Ariete Division, I am from Sulmona, just 20 kilometers from Castel di Sangro. I knew many families named Marcelli. Your grandmother's brother Michel still lives there, still runs the bakery that your great-grandfather built. The information about my family in Italy was overwhelming. I'd grown up hearing stories about the old country, but my grandmother had died when I was 12, and the connection to Italy had seemed distant and theoretical. Now I was learning about relatives I'd never known, places where my blood family still lived, connections that made the war suddenly personal in ways I'd never imagined. That evening, I wrote a letter to my mother in Philadelphia, describing the incredible coincidence of meeting family members among the Italian prisoners. Her response, which arrived 2 weeks later, confirmed much of what Giuseppe and Franco had told me and provided additional details about our family's history in Abruzzo. Your great-uncle Michel did stay in Castel di Sangro when everyone else came to America, she wrote. Your grandmother always worried about him during the Depression and the war, but we lost contact during the fighting. If Giuseppe Romano knows the family, he's telling the truth about being our cousin. This confirmation transformed my relationship with the Italian prisoners from a professional duty to something approaching a family reunion held under the strangest possible circumstances. But it also created emotional conflicts that I struggled to resolve. These men were my cousins, my paisanos, people who shared my blood and my heritage, but they had also fought for Mussolini's regime, had been allies of Nazi Germany, had participated in a war against the United States. How could I reconcile family loyalty with military duty? The answer came through conversations with Giuseppe, Franco, and other Italian prisoners who helped me understand the complexity of Italian involvement in the war and the difference between supporting Mussolini and fighting for Italy. Tony, Giuseppe said during one of our evening talks, using the familiar form of my name that family members would use, you must understand that most of us were not fighting for fascism. We were fighting for Italia, for our families, for our villages. When Germany invaded Poland, when Mussolini declared war on America, we did not choose these things. They were chosen for us. Franco explained how Italian soldiers had been caught between competing loyalties during the war. After September 1943, when Italy surrendered to the Allies, Many of us wanted to join the fight against Germany, but German forces occupied our country, threatened our families. We had to choose between resistance that might get our loved ones killed or continued service that we hoped would protect them. These conversations revealed the tragic position of Italian soldiers who'd been forced to fight for a regime they didn't support, in a war they didn't want, against countries they didn't hate. Many had welcomed Italy's surrender in 1943, but had been unable to switch sides because of German occupation and threats to their families. "When I was captured in Sicily," said Tenente Alessandro Ricci, a young officer from Napoli, "I was relieved. Finally, I could stop fighting Americans and start hoping that Italy would be liberated." Many of us saw capture as escape from an impossible situation. This perspective helped me understand that these Italian prisoners weren't my enemies. They were men who'd been caught up in historical forces beyond their control, just as my own family had been caught up in poverty and political turmoil that forced them to leave Italy and seek refuge in America. The connection deepened over the following weeks as Giuseppe and Franco shared stories about Castel di Sangro, about relatives I'd never met, about traditions and customs that my grandmother had maintained in America, but that I'd never fully understood in their original context. "Your great-uncle Michel makes the best bread in Abruzzo," Giuseppe told me. During the war, when flour was scarce, people would walk for hours to buy bread from Marcelli's bakery because they knew it would be made with honor, with pride in the family name. Franco described the village festivals that my grandmother had often talked about, the Feast of San Pietro, the harvest celebrations, the way families would gather to help each other during difficult times. "This is what we were really fighting for," he said. "Not for Mussolini or Hitler, but for the right to preserve these traditions, to protect these communities." Through these conversations, I began to understand my own heritage in ways that hadn't been possible in South Philadelphia. My grandmother's stories had been filtered through immigration, through the need to become American, through the desire to leave old troubles behind. Now I was hearing about Italy from men who'd never left, who'd maintained connections to traditions and places that were part of my own family history. But the relationship wasn't one-sided. The Italian prisoners were equally fascinated by my stories about Italian-American life, about how their cousins had adapted to life in America, about the opportunities and challenges of immigration. "Tell me about Philadelphia," Franco would ask during our evening conversations. "Are there many Italians there? Do they still speak the language? Do they remember the old customs?" I described South Philadelphia's Italian neighborhoods, the festivals and parades, the restaurants and shops, the way Italian Americans had preserved their culture while becoming Americans. But I also talked about discrimination, about the challenges my grandparents had faced, about the way war with Italy had created suspicion and hostility toward Italian Americans. "Some Americans questioned our loyalty when Italy entered the war," I explained. "They wondered if Italian Americans would support Mussolini instead of America. I joined the army partly to prove that we were real Americans, that our loyalty was to the United States." Giuseppe understood immediately. "And now you are guarding Italian prisoners, and we are your cousins. The war has made everything complicated, has divided families and confused loyalties." These discussions helped all of us understand the tragic absurdity of a war that had turned cousins into enemies, that had forced men to fight against their own relatives, that had created situations where family members faced each other across barbed wire. The relationship evolved beyond just family connections as I got to know other Italian prisoners and learned about their individual stories. Many were simple soldiers who'd been drafted into service, but others were skilled craftsmen, artists, musicians, and professionals who brought cultural richness to the camp despite their status as prisoners. Sergente Maggiore Antonio Rossi was a master stonemason from Toscana who used his skills to help improve camp facilities, creating beautiful stonework that transformed utilitarian buildings into something approaching art. Caporal Luigi Bianchi was a musician who organized an Italian prisoner orchestra that performed everything from opera to folk songs to American popular music. But it was Giuseppe Romano who became my closest friend among the prisoners, not just because of our family connection, but because of his warmth, his wisdom, and his ability to find humor and hope, even in the darkest circumstances. "Tony," he said one evening as we sat outside the barracks watching fireflies dance among the Mississippi pine trees, "this war has taken much from all of us. Time with our families, years of our lives, friends who will never come home. But it has also given us something unexpected, the chance to meet cousins we never knew existed, to understand that family extends beyond borders and uniforms. He was right. Despite the circumstances of our meeting, despite the barbed wire that separated us, despite the uniforms that marked us as guard and prisoner, Giuseppe and I had developed a genuine friendship based on shared heritage, mutual respect, and recognition of our common humanity. This friendship extended to other Italian prisoners as well. Franco Di Marco taught me traditional songs from Abruzzo that my grandmother had hummed but never fully taught me. Alessandro Ricci shared recipes for dishes that my family had always made, but that I'd never understood in their original context. But perhaps most importantly, these men helped me understand what it meant to be Italian-American in ways that hadn't been possible before the war. They showed me that being proud of my Italian heritage didn't conflict with my American loyalty, that I could honor both without betraying either. The transformation in my understanding reached its peak during the Easter celebration of 1945, when the Italian prisoners organized a traditional religious observance that included customs my family had maintained in America, but that I'd never fully appreciated. The prisoners had created a small shrine using materials donated by local Italian-American families in Mississippi, and they conducted services that combined formal Catholic ritual with folk traditions that went back centuries in rural Italy. Watching Giuseppe and Franco participate in these ceremonies, I felt connected to something larger than myself, to traditions that had sustained my ancestors through wars and famines and upheavals that stretched back to the Roman Empire. This is what we were really fighting for, Giuseppe told me after the Easter service, not for fascism or empire, but for the right to preserve these traditions, to pass them on to our children, to maintain the connections that make us who we are. But I also realized that these same traditions had been preserved and adapted by Italian Americans, like my family, that immigration to America hadn't destroyed our heritage, but had allowed it to flourish in new forms. The Easter bread that my mother made in Philadelphia was the same bread that Giuseppe's mother made in Castel di Sangro, but it had been enriched by contact with other cultures, other traditions, other ways of understanding what it meant to be human. The most profound moment came in June 1945, when news of the war's end in Europe reached Camp Shelby. Instead of celebrating victory over Italy and Germany, the moment felt more like a family reunion that could finally happen without the barrier of military conflict. Giuseppe approached me with tears in his eyes. "Tony, the war is over. We can finally stop being enemies and start being family." The sentiment was echoed by other Italian prisoners, but also by German prisoners who'd come to see me as a friend rather than a guard. The relationships formed in the camp had transcended national boundaries and created bonds that would outlast the political conflicts that had brought us together. As preparations began for repatriating Italian prisoners to their homeland, the conversations turned to maintaining contact after the war and planning for a future where former enemies could visit each other as friends and family. "When I return to Castel di Sangro," Giuseppe promised, "I will visit your great-uncle Michel and tell him about his American nephew who served with honor in the war. I will tell him that the Marcelli family in America has not forgotten their roots in Abruzzo." Franco made similar promises to carry greetings to relatives and friends, to maintain connections that had been interrupted by war, to serve as bridges between Italian and Italian-American communities that had been separated by conflict. The departure of Italian prisoners began in July 1945 and continued through August, creating a series of emotional farewells that felt more like family members leaving after a long visit than enemies being released from captivity. Giuseppe's departure on August 15th was the most difficult. After 5 months of daily conversations, shared meals, and growing friendship, saying goodbye to my newly discovered cousin felt like losing a brother. "This is not goodbye," he insisted, as we shook hands for the final time. "This is arrivederci, until we meet again. The war brought us together by accident, but family will keep us together by choice." He pressed a small carved wooden cross into my hands, inscribed with both our names and the date. "So you remember that sometimes enemies become friends, and strangers become family." Similar farewells followed with Franco, Alessandro, Antonio, Luigi, and dozens of other Italian prisoners who'd become friends despite the circumstances that had brought us together. Each departure reinforced the lesson that human connections could transcend political boundaries and create relationships that outlasted the conflicts that had initially defined them. My assignment at Camp Shelby ended in September 1945, but the friendships formed there continued through correspondence that would last for decades. The first letter from Giuseppe arrived in November 1945, postmarked Castel di Sangro, and written in a mixture of Italian and English that perfectly captured his personality. Caro Cusantoni, he wrote, I am home now with my family, but I think of you and our conversations every day. I visited your great-uncle Michel, and he cried when I told him about his American nephew. He says you must come to visit Castel di Sangro so he can embrace the grandson of his sister Rosa. The letter included photographs of the village, of the bakery, of relatives I'd never seen but who shared my features and my family name. Giuseppe had indeed served as a bridge between my American life and my Italian heritage, creating connections that enriched both. Similar letters arrived from Franco, Alessandro, and other former prisoners who'd returned to Italy with new understanding of America, a new appreciation for the Italian-American experience. Many became advocates for Italian-American friendship, using their personal experience with American guards to counter anti-American propaganda and build support for democratic institutions. In 1952, I received an invitation that brought everything full circle. Giuseppe and Franco had pooled their resources to travel to America as tourists, and they wanted to visit Philadelphia to meet my family and see how Italians had adapted to life in the new world. The reunion took place in my mother's house in South Philadelphia, with Giuseppe and Franco sitting around the same kitchen table where my grandmother had told stories about the old country 50 years earlier. But now, the stories flowed both ways. Tales of America's opportunities and challenges shared with accounts of Italy's reconstruction and renewal. Your grandmother Rosa would be proud, Giuseppe told my mother in his careful English. She raised a son who went to war and found family instead of enemies, who learned that being American and being Italian are not contradictions, but complementary truths. The visit extended beyond just my family. Giuseppe and Franco toured Italian-American neighborhoods, met with community leaders, spoke at churches and social clubs about their experience as prisoners and their perspectives on Italian-American identity. You have preserved the best of what we are, Franco told a gathering at the Italian-American Citizens Club, while adding the opportunities and freedoms that make America special. You show us that tradition and progress can work together. These interactions created lasting connections between Italian and Italian-American communities that continued to grow throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Many of the former prisoners became regular correspondents with Italian-American families, creating cultural exchanges that enriched both sides of the Atlantic. Our correspondence continued until Giuseppe's death in 1987, 42 years after our first meeting in a Mississippi prison camp. His letters chronicled his life, marriage, children, grandchildren, career as a local government official in Castel di Sangro, but they also maintained the friendship that had begun under such unlikely circumstances. Do you remember, he wrote in one of his final letters, when you told me that you didn't know whether to think of Italian prisoners as enemies or family? Now I think we know the answer. Family is stronger than politics, love is stronger than war, and friendship can grow in the strangest places. In 1995, 50 years after our first meeting, I made the pilgrimage to Castel di Sangro that Giuseppe had always encouraged. The village had changed, but the bakery was still there, still operated by the Marcelli family, still producing bread with the same recipes my great-grandfather had used a century earlier. Giuseppe's son Mario met me at the train station, and the resemblance to his father was striking. Papa talked about you until the day he died, he said. You were not just his American cousin, you were his friend who proved that enemies could become family when they recognized their common humanity. The visit included a ceremony at the village church where Giuseppe was buried, with a memorial service that honored not just his life, but the friendship that had transcended war and lasted half a century. Local officials presented me with a key to the village, recognizing me as a son of Castel di Sangro, who'd found his way home despite being born an ocean away. Your story and Giuseppe's story shows us that war divides people temporarily, said the mayor, but family and friendship connect them permanently. You prove that heritage is not about where you're born, but about who you choose to love and remember. This was the story of Sergeant First Class Anthony Tony Marcelli, 1st Armored Division Military Police, who discovered that family connections could transcend national boundaries and that guards and prisoners could become lifelong friends when they recognized their shared humanity. His experience, documented in decades of personal correspondence and family records, demonstrates how individual relationships during wartime could create lasting bonds that outlived the conflicts that initially brought people together. Marcelli's account illustrates the complex identity challenges faced by American soldiers of Italian descent during World War II, and how these challenges could be resolved through personal connections that honored both American loyalty and Italian heritage. The friendships formed at Camp Shelby showed that ethnic identity and national loyalty were not mutually exclusive, but could be complementary aspects of American identity. Tony Marcelli's story shows how accidental encounters during wartime could create intentional relationships that lasted for generations. The discovery of family connections among Italian prisoners led to lifelong friendships that enriched both Italian and Italian-American communities, proving that humanity could triumph over the political divisions that temporarily turned cousins into enemies. What struck you most about Sergeant Marcelli's story? Have you discovered unexpected family connections or lasting friendships that grew out of military service? These personal testimonies help us understand how individual relationships can transcend the larger conflicts that shape history. If you want to hear more first-hand accounts like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow we'll be sharing the story of Corporal Maria Santos Rodriguez, a Mexican-American medic who treated wounded prisoners and discovered how shared cultural values could bridge language barriers and national differences. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. Let's make sure their stories live on.